Alright, so the Phillips curve is a pretty easy concept to understand compared to the Fed Tools one, so this should be a shorter video. The graph looks something like this. Inflation is on the y-axis, and unemployment, I'm just going to abbreviate as this, is on the x-axis. And the Phillips curve is just like this. I mentioned that it is a inverse relationship. So this is point A, where we start. Just to give you a brief overview of it, if it were to shift, what this means is, and we can say here, I don't know, 4% inflation and unemployment 3%. Now if this were to shift and we move to a point B, you can clearly see this inverse relationship happening right here, as inflation would increase to like 5% and unemployment decreases to 2%. So they move in opposite directions. That's basically what that means. It's not too hard of a concept, but this isn't always how the curve moves. In terms of talking about the Fed and how the Fed can affect inflation, unemployment, since these are the dual mandate, the two things they really care about, and how this affects the Phillips curve, and why it's such an important concept to understand, is you can actually do a lot more with this. When it shifts along the Phillips curve like this, just along this line, that actually means the Fed kind of changed things unexpectedly. What happens a lot of times is companies, businesses, firms all expect things to happen in the Fed. If you pay any attention to Fed meetings or what they talk about, they always kind of say what they're expecting to do in the future. For example, if they're going to cut the federal funds rate, they set a target and they say we're going to target a decrease of 0.25% to the federal funds rate. Now, what this means is they can't do this immediately, right? It has to be done in steps and takes time, so businesses tend to react quicker than the effect of the federal funds rate changing. And I'll show you what this looks like in a graph. Right, so in a graph, if the Fed decides that they want to increase inflation, right? They may do this for a multitude of reasons. Maybe they just want to increase the money supply to boost the economy a little bit. They announce that they're going to do this. So what businesses do is it'll shift the Phillips curve out up to here, like this, and they'll move to a point where unemployment doesn't change, call this point B, and inflation does increase. This may be seen through an increase in prices or other various methods for businesses to account for this increase in the money supply. They know what they need to do, and what they usually don't do is fire their employees. That's why unemployment isn't really changing much here, but inflation does increase. And when the Fed follows through on this increase in the money supply, businesses have already worked it into their profit margins. It's already into their balance sheets and forecasts. They know what to expect. So when it does happen, this is what we'll see: an increase in inflation, no change in unemployment. What's unique is when the Fed doesn't follow through and decides not to do what they said. A good example of this is back in 2023. Um, if you heard about Silicon Valley Bank and their failure, what happened was Jerome Powell, the chair of the Fed, said that they wanted to keep interest rates low for a long amount of time. Interest rates were near zero for a very long time. And this was during a period of high tech boosts. A lot of the tech market was being invested in. There were a lot of startups that needed a lot of money, and they were putting it in banks. One of the banks they chose was Silicon Valley Bank, and with all these deposits, Silicon Valley needed somewhere to put it. So with all these extra deposits, they had to invest in bonds. They knew they couldn't wait because the chair of the Fed said that they were going to hold interest rates low for a while. Well, they ended up increasing interest rates a lot to about 5% that we are today. And this caused value of all the bonds that Silicon Valley was holding to drastically decrease, which caused tech companies to take out their money from the bank, making them insolvent, and they had failed. So JP Morgan actually had to buy them out. This is kind of an example of what happens when the Fed doesn't follow through. Businesses take into account what the Fed says, and this is credibility of the Fed. Fed has credibility, they say they're going to do something, they expect it to happen. When that happened, when the Fed said they were going to keep interest rates low for a while and then they increased it, the Fed lost a little bit of credibility. These are just some things that we need to pay attention to, and understanding the Phillips curve and how it works. You'll see this in future examples or just online when you're doing a little bit of economic research. It's just a good concept to understand and to know how it works.